Welcome to Pleasureology Island. This is actually Pleasureology Island in exile, but that's okay. I'll get back to the island before long, but in the meantime, I wanted to see what damage I could do to my enemies being all imagination-based worldviews. I'm a militant realist. I'm a positive realist. I believe that we can have a positively happy life, a real life in this earth during our lifetime. And we don't need to worry about what happens before or after that, because when we die, our consciousness, which is produced by our brain, will no longer be produced by our brain. Our brain will die, and our consciousness will simply evaporate. And at that point, we will have no more consciousness of anything for any time at all. It will last no time at all. Death will last no time at all, because without consciousness, we cannot sense the passing of time. Without consciousness, we cannot sense whether we are there or not, because we're not there. And only if we had a consciousness would we be able to notice whether we were there or not. And if we did have a consciousness, then obviously that would mean that we were there. And that's all that we're ever going to experience, is being a consciousness who actually is here in this body while we're alive. And then, when that stops, nothing will happen for no time at all, for zero time. We won't know anything at all. We won't remember having ever lived. We won't regret anything that we ever did. We won't be proud of anything we ever did. We won't remember anything we ever did. We won't remember all our happiness or our unhappiness. The only time we can actually win the game of life is in the present moment. If we're having a good time in the present moment, if we're doing something that we enjoy, that we feel is meaningful, then, and with other people that we're having a good emotional exchange with, or if we're by ourselves, creating euphoria in our own consciousness. Those are the only things that have positive value, euphoric states of consciousness, and they have value while we are experiencing them in the here and now moment. And this is sort of the lesson of Zen meditation. And this is why I think Zen meditation is very important for learning to escape the mental chains and the emotional chains of Christianity if we happen to have been unfortunate enough to have been born into a Christian family and received a Christian upbringing. We're all damaged as a result of that. That it was an emotionally and mentally abusive process that was inflicted upon us by the people who brought us up, who thought they were doing the right thing because they were deluded, and they weren't necessarily stupid, but they were completely deluded, meaning they were believing that the imaginary is real. And in order to escape all these delusional worldviews, we only have to do one simple thing, and that is decide we're going to quit believing that the imaginary is real. Because that's a stupid thing to do. It's stupid to believe that something that nobody's ever seen or heard or touched or felt or witnessed or experienced actually exists. People may have lots of religious experiences inside their own consciousness that their emotional brain produces. And that's what religion is. Religion is a means of managing our emotional brain in order to reduce our anxiety and increase our feelings of safety and protection. And that's what religion does, and that's why people get addicted to religion. It's their way of making themselves feel safe. And as soon as we attack their religion and say, I'm sorry, that's a bunch of imaginary bullshit, they immediately get panicky because their sense of safety is being attacked. And when people get panicky and are being attacked, what do? They counterattack. And so anytime you talk to a religion addict and tell them that their addiction is an addiction to an imaginary bunch of bullshit, they are going to get very defensive and very argumentative. So the best thing to do is to stay as far away from such people as possible. If you happen to get backed into a corner by one of them, don't back down. Continue to be a positive realist and say, no, I'm sorry. I only believe in what's real. That's what's true, is what's real. Anything that's imaginary is bullshit, and I will not believe it. And you're an idiot for believing it, frankly. And so that kind of conversation is going to go nowhere. You might as well avoid having that kind of conversation in the first place. But sometimes you can't help it. Anyway, I've been reading Reddit posts on the internet in a subreddit called Deconstruction. And I find this an absolutely fascinating and heartbreaking subreddit, Deconstruction. There's also Ex-Christian. Both of these are people telling about the emotional difficulties primarily that they're having in the process of leaving the Christian religion and having to deal with family members, particularly who are still Christians and who are still addicted to their delusion. All religions are false truth claims about the unknowable. All right, the unknowable is anything that we cannot detect with our senses or our scientific instruments. Okay, we don't know that it really exists. We don't know if it exists or not. If we can't detect it, we can't observe it. And so we cannot say that it actually exists. So in Deconstruction, people are talking about their personal stories. And this is, for me, I'm a psychologist, okay? I have a background in general psychology, experimental psychology, humanistic psychology, and neuroscience, as well as anatomy and physiology, and history of religions, because my father was an evangelical preacher, and I've spent my entire life deconstructing. I've spent my entire life reconstructing my own consciousness, my own worldview, my own intellect, and my own emotions in order to overcome the traumatizing effects of a Christian upbringing, which left me very nervous, anxious, and neurotic. And I would have had really rotten relationships for the rest of my life with people if I had not managed to learn how to heal myself emotionally and become a much calmer person. Doesn't mean I don't get angry when there's a reason to get angry. Part of being relaxed is, in fact, being able to feel all your emotions and not suppress them, not deny them, but actually feel them and express them. That's part of being relaxed, that's part of being healthy. But our ultimate goal is to become calm when there's nothing going on that should be upsetting us, okay? If we're in default mode, our default mode should not be anxiety, but our default mode is anxiety if we were raised in Christianity, because Christianity is based on false promises and false threats. Imaginary promises about imaginary people and places, imaginary gods, imaginary heaven and hell, imaginary threats, and the imaginary idea that God or the devil or both are constantly intervening in our lives all the time. And we have to make sure that we only do things that will please God and not do things that the devil wants us to do. Otherwise, we're a bad person and we're going to get punished for it. God's love is totally conditional. They talk about it being unconditional. That's bullshit. Okay? The God of Judeo-Christianism has been a judgmental God from the beginning. He's been a warrior God. He started out as a warrior God, a horrible God who was leading the Israelites into Palestine to take over country that didn't belong to them and giving them an imaginary, legitimate reason for doing so. Yes, our imaginary God told us this land belongs to us. You've been living here for 1,000 years. Too bad. We're coming in here. We're taking over. And at the time that the Israelite nation formed, I don't think that's what happened. I think the Israelites did come in. They infiltrated, a lot of people infiltrated from the desert areas that were nomads, and they infiltrated areas in the hill country of Judea and northern Palestine. Uh, they infiltrated into this area and mingled with the agricultural people who were already living there, many of whom had fled from the coastal areas where the Philistines, who were actually from Greece, had settled recently, and all these refugees had to flee those invading Greeks up into the hills, and these shepherd people came over and mingled with them, and they eventually formed an alliance against the Philistines down in the lowlands so that they could maintain their independence in the hill country, and yet they traded with the Greek people of the Philistine cities because they would trade throughout the Mediterranean to other places. So there was commerce going on, but there was also occasionally, there was raiding going on by the people in the hills against the Philistines. And so the Philistines would come back against the people in the hills and try to suppress them. So there was warfare going on. And finally, the Israelites, who were a conglomeration of different people living in the hills, got together under a king named Saul, and he was able to defeat the Philistines for a while, but then he was defeated by the Philistines. And so then the next king that came along was David, who was a much better general, and he was able to defeat the Philistines. Yahweh was David's God. He was of the tribe of Judah, and the tribe of Judah was the tribe of Yahweh, or Yehweh, I think is how it ought to be pronounced, Yehweh. And so then they established this monarchy there, which immediately split after David's son Solomon. Then the monarchy split into a northern half and a southern half. Now, what's the importance of this in relation to Christianity and anxiety and the rest of this? We have to understand why Christianity is a totally false worldview. It's not even remotely true. It's not even partially true. It's completely false. And to do that, we have to understand the history of the Israelite kingdoms, the northern and southern kingdoms. And that will help us understand the background of Second Temple Judaism under the Persian Empire. And then when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, Second Temple Judaism survived, but it was having a lot of troubles. And at this point, apocalyptic Judaism arose, meaning this belief that Yahweh or Yahweh was going to come down out of the sky, or else he was going to send angels coming down out of the sky with armies of angels, and they were perhaps going to unite with the Jews on the territory in Judea to defeat the Romans, overthrow the Romans, get rid of the Romans, throw them out of Judea and the land of Israel, and reestablish an independent Israelite kingdom. And that's the basic viewpoint, this viewpoint of apocalyptic Judaism. That was the viewpoint of John the Baptist, who then taught it to Yeshua of Galilee, whom we know as Jesus, okay? John the Baptist was saying, all right, the time has come. Yahweh has punished us for 500 years practically because our ancestors worshipped other gods besides Yahweh. Our ancestors worshipped other imaginary beings beside the one imaginary being that we Israelites believe is our own imaginary being. Our ancestors worshipped other imaginary beings, and therefore our imaginary being has been punishing us for 500 years by letting the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem, by letting the Persians have dominion over us for 200 years, and then the Alexander the Great conquering the Persian Empire, and now his successors, the Seleucids, the Greeks, have power over us, and now the Romans have taken power over us, and we're screwed. We've been screwed for 500 years. But, John said, now the time has come. Our punishment has ended. We've served our sentence. And our God, Yahweh, is going to bring the kingdom down from the sky to the earth. That's what the kingdom of heaven was. It started up there in the sky with Yahweh, and he and his angels were going to come on down and establish Yahweh's kingdom on earth and build a brand new temple in Jerusalem and purify the entire land, cleanse it from all the impurity that the Greeks and the Syrians and the Egyptians had all been polluting the land with their foreign gods and all this. We're going to repurify the land, and we're going to live in peace in the land of Israel forever. And all the other nations are going to bow down to us. They're going to come to us and say, "Oh, Israelites, how come you're so good? How come you're so great?" And we're going to say, "Well, it's because of our God and the laws that he gave us and this temple that we've got here where we worship him." And everybody's going to look to us as being the smart guys in the world. That was the Israelite apocalyptic view of apocalyptic Judaism. Apocalypse means something that's been hidden that is now revealed. Because somebody gets an imaginary idea in their head, they get a vision, they get a dream, they get high on cannabis or some other psychoactive substance, and they visualize Yahweh. They visualize Yahweh's court and the angels, and one of the angels takes them around and shows them everything that's going to happen. And so then they come back and they reveal this hidden knowledge to the rest of us in these scrolls that they write. That's apocalypticism, is revealing something that's been hidden, that only the person who has had a really vivid imagination has been able to come up with. And this typically involves, these apocalyptic visions typically involve an imagined end of time. The time is now. John the Baptist said, "The kingdom is at hand. It's so close you can reach out and grab it. That's how close it is." So that's why you've got to repent and say you're sorry and try and be as pure as you can so you'll be able to get into that kingdom. And this was such a rabble-rousing thing to say that Herod, who was king of the area where John happened to be doing his baptizing on the Jordan River, Herod had him arrested and executed. But Yeshua from Galilee had been one of John the Baptist's disciples. He'd been hanging out with him for a while. John said basically to him, "You're my successor. You're the one, in fact, maybe John said, you're really special. Maybe you're the one when the kingdom comes. Maybe you're the one who's going to rule the kingdom." So Yeshua got infected with John's delusion. They're all having delusions about imaginary beings, Yahweh, the warrior God of Israel, and all his imaginary angels were going to come down and take care of the real Romans. And unfortunately, the Romans were real, and they weren't going to go away just because of some imaginary wishful thinking. So instead of, when Jesus went around the countryside and he told everybody the kingdom's coming, we've got to go up to Jerusalem because that's where we want to be when the kingdom comes. Let's go on up there. And they all went up there. He took a whole big crowd of people up there with him to Jerusalem at Passover. And they put him on a donkey because that's what how a king was supposed to enter the kingdom. A donkey was actually would have been what King David rode. He would have, and so Yeshua, if this was true, that they actually did this procession into Jerusalem as the Gospel of Mark and all the other Gospels talk about, if that really happened, then Yeshua was riding like a king, and he wasn't riding side saddle. He'd have hitched up his tunic and sat astride that donkey and would have ridden him boldly into the city while the people shouted, "Hail to the Son of David." The Son of David. What does that mean? That means the people were acclaiming him as the descendant of King David, either the spiritual descendant or the actual descendant, but anyway, the new David. And David had been the Son of God in the sense of God's favorite, supposedly. According to the Old Testament, God, just loved David so much. That's why David was always successful in his battles, because God loved him so much. David was God's son. And so now Yeshua is taking the place of Yahweh's son David, and he now is the new David riding into Jerusalem while the people who accompanied him are all shouting, "Hail, hail to the son of David." And he rides up into the temple and takes a look around at it and says, well, this sucks. He's already prejudiced against the temple, okay? Yeshua was already prejudiced against the temple because this temple was built by Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the puppet of the Romans, and the Romans were the people who were oppressing the Jews. The Romans were the evil ones who were going to be destroyed by Yahweh and his angels as soon as the kingdom was coming, okay? The Roman and King Herod, who had built this huge temple, costing in those days what would have cost billions of dollars to build this huge temple in Jerusalem, which also functioned as a huge fort, a huge military fortress. So Herod, the puppet of the Romans, was establishing his military control, his despotic control over Judea. So this temple was profane in the eyes of Yeshua and his followers. This was not truly Yahweh's temple. And the prophecies, the Old Testament prophecies, said, no, they're going to build a new temple. Get rid of this temple, and there will be a new temple. And so that's the thing that one of the things that Yeshua said, apparently, in Jerusalem, and they think that's one of the few authentic things we can know that Yeshua said, was that this temple was going to be destroyed. And when they brought Yeshua to trial a few days later, they twisted around and said, Yeshua said that he himself was going to destroy this temple and build a new one in 3 days. Ha ha, what an idiot. And what an arrogant, blasphemous thing for him to claim. I don't think he claimed that at all. I think he claimed that Yahweh was going to come down with all his angels, and they were going to get rid of all the Romans, get rid of all the old temple, and build a brand new temple. And Yeshua wanted to be there with his followers in the valley between the Mount of Olives and the hill right next to it, because according to the prophecies, that's where Yahweh was actually going to stand. He was going to have 1 foot on the Mount of Olives and 1 foot on the other mountain next to it. And if you could stand between those two, you would be safe and protected as long as Yahweh didn't decide to take a dump at that moment. So Yeshua had this belief that the kingdom was going to come, but of course it didn't come. And he believed that the temple was profane, that it was blasphemous, and it needed to be destroyed. And he went up there into the temple and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the people who were selling animals there. This was his demonstration of how profane this stuff was, and this was his symbolic action, like this temple is going to be overthrown in the same way that I am turning over these tables. This was sort of a symbolic, prophetic activity on his part, because I think he really did believe he was a prophet, and that Yahweh's spirit entered him, possibly when he was baptized. He was under the delusion that Yahweh's spirit had entered him, and so from that point he acted on as though I am the voice of Yahweh. Whatever I say, Yahweh is telling me to say, and that's what I'm telling everybody else. And the kingdom is coming, and that's what and we go up here, and this temple is profane, it's going to be destroyed, and you people who run this temple are a bunch of capitalists who are squeezing the poor people, who have just barely enough to get by, and yet you are wringing the shekels out of them every time they have to come and make a sacrifice at the temple. And this was true because Herod had turned the temple over to his own hand-picked high priests, and those high priests were not from the area around Jerusalem. First, he got one from Babylonia, a Jew from Babylonia. See, Herod wasn't Jewish himself. He was a Jewish convert, basically. His father had converted to Judaism, but he was an Idumean, he was an Edomite, living down by Petra in that area. southeast of the Dead Sea. But he converted to Judaism in order to qualify as the king of the Jews. But he was totally Greco-Roman in his dress, in his language. He probably spoke Greek most of the time. And in everything about him, he was, like a Wall Street banker, a modern guy or a modern president in a suit and tie. And he was in no way a traditional Jewish guy. And the high priests that he appointed to the Jerusalem temple, he didn't want the local Jewish high priests, the Hasmoneans who had been running things until then. He didn't want to leave them in place because they might turn against him and try and take the power for themselves, because they came from the family that had actually been ruling Judea in the previous 100 years before Herod. So he wanted to get rid of those guys. So he imported high priests first from Babylonia, then from Egypt. And these high priests came in, brought their relatives and everybody, and they turned the temple into a big money-making business. And the whole temple became just a money machine for the high priests and their relatives. And so these were the people. If you read the end of the Gospel of Matthew, there's a long, long section where Jesus is just ripping up the scribes and Pharisees, but he's really talking to the temple priests, the people who make their living on this temple that is squeezing the poor people. So obviously Jesus is a very revolutionary kind of guy. He's stirring up trouble. So the high priests from the Jerusalem temple plot to capture this guy. They don't want the Romans. The high priests are supposed to really be in control of the city. They're supposed to keep the peace in the city, and they've got their own police force, the temple police force. They've got the police force, and they control the city. But the Romans also have a garrison in Jerusalem, and the Romans expect the high priest and his people to keep the Jewish people calm. And so here's Jesus in the middle of Passover, the biggest festival of the year, when everybody in the world is coming and converging on Jerusalem, and Jesus is stirring up trouble. So the high priest and his ruling circle and the lead priests in the temple, they've actually been debating Jesus in the temple courtyard in the previous days, and Jesus has been kind of making them look stupid, and the crowd is really on Jesus's side, and these priests of the temple really are pissed off at having been humiliated by Jesus this way, and they say, okay, we're going to get this guy. So they send some spies to follow him, to mingle with the crowd and follow Jesus, follow him to where he has dinner that night, and then follow him from there out into the valley and see where it is he's going to camp for the night. Because all the pilgrims who came to Jerusalem that couldn't afford a hotel room would camp out on the hills across from the temple, including the Mount of Olives and this Garden of Gethsemane at the base of the Mount of Olives. This was like a campsite, a campground, the Garden of Gethsemane. So the spies of the priests from the Jerusalem temple saw where Jesus and his buddies camped out for the night. And they went back up, they went back to the town, went back to the temple, and told the priests, okay, get the police guard ready, get all of our soldiers ready, and with their clubs and everything else, and we'll go down and get this guy tonight because we know where he's staying. And so they went down and they got him. Now, was Judas among them to identify them? I don't think so. I think there was probably just somebody else who had been, watching Jesus very closely over the past few days and who was able to identify him that night in the torchlight. And so they managed to grab Jesus, and they started wailing into all of the followers around him with their clubs. These were soldiers, these were professional, tactical police squad, basically, who were experienced in riot control. And so they drove away everybody else, and they captured Jesus, took him up crucified him. First, they had the Jewish trial, and then because the Jewish Sanhedrin was not legally permitted to execute someone, they had to get approval from the Roman governor, Pilate, who had arrived in town for the Passover feast. And he usually stayed down on the coast, but he came up for the feast. And so he was there at hand. And they probably waited until Pilate was there before they arrested Jesus, so they'd be able to turn him right over to Pilate immediately. Pilate didn't waste any time. He said, do you deny the charges? And Yeshua didn't say a thing to him. Why not? Yeshua didn't recognize him as an authority over him. Yeshua said, Yehovah, my God, is the only authority over me, not you, some Roman, so I'm not even going to talk to you. I'm not going to say a word. Yehovah is going to rescue me. And that's what Yeshua believed, was that Yehovah would rescue him, which of course didn't happen. They got him up on the cross by 9 o'clock in the morning after they'd arrested him at midnight the night before. They didn't waste any time. It was like boom, boom, boom. And Jesus is up on the cross. And as he's dying, he looks up in the sky and he says, Yehovah, or he says, Eloi, using El or Elohim, the old other name for God, which wasn't quite as sacred as Yehovah. Eloi, lama sabachthani. Where are the armies of angels? Where are the armies of angels that are going to rescue me? Where are they? You promised the kingdom was coming. But it didn't come. Because Yehovah is a delusion. And Yeshua was delusional for believing in this whole Jewish apocalyptic nonsense. So he dies pretty rapidly. It doesn't take long to die on the cross sometimes. Your heart can give out pretty fast. And Joseph of Arimathea he was from a town halfway between Jerusalem and the coast, so he wasn't a Jerusalemite as such, but he probably was somewhat influential, and he certainly was wealthy, because he went to Pilate, and ordinarily, the corpses of executed criminals are allowed to rot on the cross, and then are thrown in the garbage. And that's what would have happened to Yeshua. But Joseph of Arimathea thought that Yeshua was a holy man, and he wanted to preserve his body and put it in a tomb. And if he could put it in a nice tomb, specially for Yeshua, it would become a place of pilgrimage, and people could go there and honor the memory of Yeshua, this fallen prophet. And so Joseph, wanting to preserve Yeshua's body from any further humiliation, went to Pilate and said, Pilate, may I have Yeshua's body? Now, when you go and ask a favor of a Roman governor, of a Roman official at all, you don't expect to get your favor just by asking for it. You go with money in hand. So Joseph went with a sufficient amount of money to persuade Pilate to let him have this body. Pilate was glad to sell it to him. Pilate was planning on going back to Italy before too long, and he wanted to make as much money in the provinces as he possibly could. And this was one of the main ways that you get money, is by doing favors for people, doing legal favors for people. So Pilate, no doubt, struck a hard bargain, and Joseph was able to meet Pilate's price, and Pilate gave Joseph an authorization for the body and sent him with a soldier over to the cross. They took the body down and they put it nearby in a tomb that happened to have some vacancies. And Joseph of Arimathea would have had 2 servants with him to take the body, 2 non-Jewish servants, because Joseph was a Jew. He wasn't going to pollute himself by touching a dead body on the day before Passover. So he had his servants do it. They were probably from Syria or Egypt or some other place. They'd probably been captured in war, or they'd gotten in debt or something. Anyway, they were people whose ritual purity didn't matter to Joseph. So he had them put the body in a tomb, and he had them push the big stone in front of the tomb. You put that stone there so that during the night, the dogs, the wild dogs that run through the street, can't get into the tomb and start feasting on the bodies. So they closed the tomb up, and by this time, it was almost sundown, and at sundown, the Passover Sabbath was beginning. So Joseph and his servants had to scurry on home and try to get there before the sun went down. And as soon as that happened, nothing could happen for the next 24 hours in Jerusalem. People couldn't travel more than a few hundred yards. They couldn't do any work. They couldn't be seen to be doing anything that was not holy, that wasn't religion related. So for the next 24 hours, the tomb remained undisturbed. But then at sundown on Saturday, Jesus was crucified on Friday. On Saturday at sundown, the Sabbath is over. And so in that case, all bets are off. Now anything goes. All right, the sun goes down. The body's in the tomb. It's there all night Saturday night, but by Sunday morning, it's gone. Where did it go? Now, let's assume that we're going to find a naturalistic explanation for this rather than a miraculous explanation. Okay? A natural explanation that could easily have actually happened. That any one of us would say, oh yeah, that would make sense. Okay, I can see that. So let's assume that somebody had to roll back the stone. It only took two guys to roll the stone in place, so it would only take two guys to roll it back. And then they had to get the body out and take it away somewhere. Who would want to do that? We need means, motive, and opportunity, right? Well, at night, it's not easy to get in and out of Jerusalem. You have to have a special, because they close up the city gates, after a certain point at night, maybe 10 p.m. I don't know when they close down the gates, and it's hard to get in and out. So you got to be somebody with access to go in and out. But the main thing is you got to have a motive. Who would want to steal Jesus's body? Well, of course, the story goes around that it was the disciples themselves that stole Jesus's body and then later claimed that Jesus had come back to life. Well, that makes no sense at all psychologically or emotionally. That would mean the disciples knew from the outset that they were just lying and trying to convince everybody of a lie that wasn't true. And why would they devote their lives to trying to persuade people of something that they knew wasn't true? So I don't think it's credible that the disciples themselves would have stolen the body. But there were other people who didn't like Jesus very much because he'd been arguing with them for the past few days, been making fools of them up in the temple, and had been saying that the temple was a corrupt place, was not really a holy temple, a temple that ought to be destroyed and replaced. And who was it that had gotten him crucified? Well, of course, it was the priests of the Jerusalem temple who had gotten Jesus crucified, and they were expecting that his body would be disposed of in the same way that all executed criminals would be. Probably taken down to the trash dump of Gehenna at the lower end of Jerusalem and tossed into the trash there, along with all the remains of the sacrifices that had been being made, all the lambs that were being slaughtered for Passover. All that crap was being thrown in Gehenna at the trash dump. And that's what the priests of Jerusalem expected would happen to Jesus's body. But Joseph of Arimathea got to Pilate first and bought the body from Pilate And Pilate sold it to him for a good price. And so when the priests found out about it, when Joseph of Arimathea and his servants and the soldier along with him came from Pilate, came to the cross while Jesus was still on the cross, the temple priests who were standing around jeering at Jesus and laughing at him and throwing shit at him, as he hung there stark naked on the cross, by the way, there's no little loincloth around Jesus. Part of the humiliation of crucifixion was being stripped naked in public and being left up there to public view totally naked, which was a really humiliating thing for Jews or for anybody. Anyway, when the temple priests saw Joseph of Arimathea's men taking Jesus's body down, they probably went to the sergeant and said, "What are you doing? Who authorized this?" And the sergeant said, "Well, no, sorry, Joseph's got this authorization from Pilate. It's the orders. I'm supposed to give him the body." And so the priests were furious that Jesus's body was being taken away and was going to be cared for and was going to be put in a special tomb somewhere. And they really didn't want that, because the tombs of people who had been martyred, who had died for the holy cause, these tombs became places of pilgrimage that people would go to, and that would be a place where people could get together and argue and talk about revolt, talk about revolution. You could meet other revolutionaries at this temple, at this tomb, of Yeshua, the martyr, who had died for the cause of the kingdom of God. So the temple priests did not want Jesus's body to survive in any way, to be taken and made a shrine of anywhere. So, simple enough. Sundown comes around on Saturday night. Okay, the body's been in the tomb 24 hours already. There are lots of slaves attached to the temple, non-Jewish slaves from Syria, Mesopotamia, even perhaps, Egypt, and so forth. And so these non-Jewish slaves, under the direction of one or two of the temple priests, they've been watching very carefully when Joseph of Arimathea put that body in the grave. It wasn't that far away. And so they knew exactly where the body was. So they went there. The servants, the slaves, rolled back the tomb. They went inside, but they wanted to make absolutely sure they had the right body. So they unwrapped the body, and sure enough, they had the right body. Then they probably put it in some gunny sacks or wrapped it in some burlap or something and slung it over the back of a donkey and took it out of there, took it down to Gehenna, and threw it on the trash heap in Gehenna where they felt it belonged in the first place, and got rid of it. And then the next morning, the women come to the tomb because they want to take care of Jesus's body. The men don't go near there because they're scared they're going to get arrested. None of his male followers would go anywhere near that tomb, but the women did. Tomb's empty, and they go away. And at that point, the Gospel of Mark breaks off. We don't know really what happened after that. It says that the women were scared and didn't tell anybody about it until later. Maybe they all went back to Galilee, and then Peter and some of the others started having dreams about Jesus, which is something that happens very commonly when a person is dead. You have very, very vivid dreams of that person if you've been close to them. So vivid you might think that they're actually right there talking to you in that dream and that they're really alive. And so maybe they had these really vivid dreams of Jesus, and they were convinced that he had not died, and that the reason the tomb was empty was that he had risen from the dead. And that's how the whole thing got started. This is a naturalistic explanation of how they created this hope, this delusional hope that Jesus wasn't dead, but that he was going to come back someday. That whole story in Luke, by the way, where Jesus is there for like 40 days and nights with the disciples, that's total bullshit, because you don't find that in any of the other Gospels. And all these stories just got made up. It's sort of like Elvis sightings. Anyway, one of the most important things that can help us realize that Christianity is totally false and has no relevance to our lives is to see how completely different that Yeshua of Galilee of history was from the Jesus myth that the churches have taught us all to believe in. The idea that Jesus knew he was God's son from the beginning, and he came to earth with the purpose of dying on the cross to save us from our sins, and then that would allow us all to go back to heaven. Not at all. Yeshua of Galilee had none of those things in mind. He was the victim of delusional Jewish apocalypticism that believed there was going to be a kingdom on earth. If you look in the book of Revelation, that's probably the closest, most accurate picture of what these apocalypticists believed, was that there was going to be a kingdom on earth. And Jesus was made to say in the Gospels, in all of the Gospels, he is made to say, we don't know if he actually said it or not, I don't think he did, but he was made to say this is going to happen before this generation dies out. Before the people who are standing here die out, this will come back. That's not something Jesus would have said, because Jesus thought it was going to happen when he went to Jerusalem. He thought it was right now, kingdom's at hand right now. But later on, the disciples said, no, it's going to come, but it'll come before we all die. Before, some of us will be here and we'll still, live in the kingdom, and there will be a resurrection of all the dead. All the dead people will come up out of the graves and will be living again in this kingdom. In fact, the Gospel of Matthew, and I didn't realize this till recently, has this amazing thing happen. When Jesus dies, during that weekend when he's dead, according to Matthew, tombs opened, and the dead, some of the dead rose up, some of the dead holy ones rose up and walked around Jerusalem for 2.5 days or 3 days, and people saw them, And then I guess they went back to the tomb, I don't know, what afterwards. But that, again, is only reported in the Gospel of Matthew, which is another reason why we know it's made up, it's bullshit. It's like the raising of Lazarus from the dead, when Jesus supposedly said, Lazarus, come forth. That's bullshit too, because you don't find that in any of the Gospels except John. And that's the most spectacular miracle Jesus was ever supposed to have done, to raise somebody who'd been dead for 3 days. And you don't find it in any of the other Gospels. Oh, shit, we forgot to put in that story about Lazarus. Oh, we didn't quite have room. Can't go back and put it in now. Oh, well, too bad. We'll just leave that one out. No, that's not right. It appears only in the Gospel of John because the Gospel of John made it up, because the Gospel of John is totally made up. But anyway, one of the best things we can do for our own emotional sanity and health is to recognize how stupid Christianity is, how ridiculous and delusional the whole worldview is. We should not give any compassion, really, for people who still believe that bullshit. Okay? We can feel sorry for them, I suppose, but we should not let them push us around. We should not give any respect to them for believing delusional bullshit. No one should get respect for believing the imaginary. The imaginary is not real. People who believe that the imaginary is real are delusional. They do not deserve our respect at all. Okay, that's enough ranting from me, but I'll continue on next time and explain a little bit more about why Christianity is a delusional worldview that positive realists, humanistic realists, who want to have happiness in this life and who want to be emotionally happy, we need to understand how completely false Christianity is, so that we are no longer anxious about any of their false threats, and we are no longer depressed about any of their false promises. Okay, talk to you next time. Thanks for listening.